This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses.
So, what has Bruce Lee taught me about gear and gear acquisition syndrome? Well, I was actually watching the UFC the other day when John Jones fought a very old Stipe. And at the end of that, because he finished the fight with a spinning, called like a turning side kick. And he said that he'd been training that a lot. And it kind of reminded me, and he mentioned the Bruce Lee thing, like beware the man not who has trained 1,000 kicks or something like that, but who has trained a kick 1,000 times. It's probably butchered it, but something like that. And it kind of got me thinking about this gear thing, because as someone who makes lots of gear videos and talks about gear a lot, I think the idea, certainly that I don't try to portray, but in general, people kind of assume that you kind of think you're an expert on a lot of things. I tried to keep more of an open sort of question in mind, because I honestly don't think that I know that many pieces of gear that well. there are some things that I feel like I know quite well, and maybe more than sort of maybe an average sort of person, like for instance like the Helix stuff, just because I've spent so much time using Helix Native, the Helix and HX Stomp, that just you naturally kind of pick up some things versus someone who's never picked up the thing at all. But still wouldn't say I'm an expert on any of it. And it kind of got me thinking about, yeah, the gear thing in general. I've got a load of drive pedals. I've just been selling a bunch off actually, and I thought I knew I had a thing that was working for me, and then recently the Nobels ODR 1 comes along, and I'm suddenly rethinking things again. And I'm thinking, right, what I really want to do going forward is kind of have these things that I do actually know well. Like, I know what these things do. And so I'm thinking that going into 2025, this is maybe going to be a bit more of my goal. So in terms of an amp that works for me, like the Deluxe Reverb, I found this year works really nicely. I want to get to know a Deluxe Reverb really well. And you think about people that have maybe an amp that they've used forever, like Robin Ford with his Dumble, like has become a part of his kind of tone, his identity. Now, yes, he still sounds like Robin Ford if he's playing through a Super Reverb, or more recently the Lil Walter thing, but that amp that he knows best is presumably that Dumble. And for me, you know, I have had loads and loads of complicated amps in the past, like Mesa Boogies, lots and lots of stuff. I've thought that this Dumble thing was a thing I wanted to chase, but maybe that's turned out to be a little bit of a path to nowhere. Yes, I'll still demo other amplifiers and all that sort of stuff, but in terms of amps that I use more regularly, and if I'm going to be gigging, I think the Deluxe Reverb is going to be something I try to get to know better. Having experienced it, plugged it in, played it at home, it's kind of like, this does a lot of things really well. I'd like to get to know that better and really know that piece of gear well. The VHT-D50 above it, I've used the drive channel live, and I think actually I kind of prefer the sound of pedals into the clean, so that could be there for gigs as well, where I'm wanting a head and cabinet, so it's slightly easier to travel around. Still maybe on the hunt for a Deluxe Reverb in a head format, but am I just going to buy an extra amp just for the sake of that? Probably not. I've got the Pro Reverb there for really special occasions. I've got the Matchless Lightning clone made by Rift outside as well, and that's a more Voxy style amplifier, but I tend to use that fairly clean anyway, so, and that's got 6v6 power tubes. I feel like I know that amp fairly well, but do you get what I mean? Like, there's a lot of, even in my small amp collection, there's things that I know less well than others, and I'm just taking now a Bad Cat Cub to a gig this evening, so lots to think about there. But that's kind of the goal for me, to try and get to know these pieces of gear better, just rather than sort of churning through gear and thinking this would be the next best thing. So the Nobels ODR is on my pedal board now. I think that's going to be my core rhythm tone and a really key pedal for me. This could change, of course, but I think it's going to be that way. And then I've got a 5-watt World bus next to it. And this is actually kind of simplifying things a little bit as well, because it's no longer like, I've got all these drive pedals up here, I need to try them all. It's like, well, this is kind of my core thing, and I'm kind of liking that as an idea. In terms of guitars, I think this is really where this comes down to, because pedals and amps and that sort of thing are a huge ingredient of the tone, but the thing that you actually interface with most of all and touch most of all, the guitar. And the thing that varies so much from guitar to guitar is like the bending on a guitar, and really knowing how a guitar is going to respond, or whether, you know, this E string stays in tune when you do certain things, and how the guitar returns to tune. All of these little things which are really, you only get, I think, if you spend a lot of time with that specific guitar. And I said, you know, in a video before that I started to kind of lose a bit of that bond with this specific guitar, which has been a guitar that I've played pretty much every day since 2018. And because of the fear of having to do a fret job, I kind of sort of put it in the cupboard and retired it in a lot of ways. But I think maybe that's a bit of a shame, because if you play best on one specific guitar, this is like your weapon of choice. I think sticking with it is maybe a benefit to some extent. I don't know how many guitars you guys have in like your regular rotation. I have a stand here which has 3, and I think 3 guitars is like a good number which gives you variety, but not too much, you know, shifting and changing things like scale length from hardtail to trem. You know, doing that regularly, I don't think necessarily is a super good route to consistency in some ways. There was an interview with Keith Urban and John Mayer were talking about how you can really tell when someone knows their guitar, and I guess that comes out because they're maybe trying something that's a bit more adventurous than they try on other guitars. For me personally, like a guitar that I know really well, I'll go for some bends on. A guitar that I don't know, I just generally will avoid bends because it's kind of like I don't know where this is going to go, and that's basically how it's been for me. Also, things like your muscle memory of where switches are. When I switch over to something like a PRS guitar where the switch is over here, that does really change the way I play as well. So that for me is like one of those things where like just having loads and loads of gear for the sake of it, or because it looks good, or because you thought it might necessarily inspire you in some way, is not always the thing for me. Sometimes it can be more about like just sitting down and wanting to play the guitar and finding your bits of gear that allow you to do that quickly. For me, an HX Stomp as well, or Helix Native, really great from that point of view as well, where it's just like, well, if I know that I'm just wanting to like record quickly, jump into Helix Native, put on my Eric Lee 2023 preset and just start playing. And that's kind of a beautiful thing about guitar. I was speaking to Keith about this as well. So Keith from 5 Watt World has this approach, or tries to, like me, where I think we don't necessarily see ourselves as trying to have a large collection of gear, if that makes sense. It obviously goes a little bit against like the idea of gear demoing in general, but like trying to keep a collection that maybe can belong in one room, for me is kind of like a bit of a thing. And I think Keith is somewhat similar in that he doesn't want loads and loads of gear, and he's talked to me about like needing to sell off some things. And he kind of just said, I've ended up with 4 PRS Miras. And I was like, how has this happened when you've, you know, sold them before you bought one? Like, why do you end up then buying 2 or 3? And I don't know if any of you guys are in the same thing where you tend to duplicate a piece of gear that you really like. So I've got like lots of K-line Strats, for example. I kind of put this idea to him. He basically had some reasons, like playability wise, and that there was a specific era that they were making these, and they're lightweight, they play really nicely, they do a lot of things. He wanted something to put some Ron Ellis pickups in, and so he's ended up with a few of them. And I kind of put this idea to him, which came to me from this idea of clutter, where kind of clutter can be defined as a collection without order, and possibly when we end up buying 2 guitars which are pretty much the same thing, and you hear people doing this, like I've got Tony up the road's got a father-in-law, I think, who has like gone through collections where you'd like have lots of the same guitar, like PRS or lots of Ibanez AZs, or you know, you have like a chunk of those same guitars. I think that is about trying to declutter in your mind. You give your collection like a sense, like an order, and I think that's maybe where this comes from. Maybe, I don't know, let me know your thoughts on that in the comments. But do you think it's a good goal to have like a guitar that you know really well, a pedal or 2 that you know really well? So for me, like a drive pedal that I really want to know, oh, if I put this knob here, what is that doing? Get to know that sort of thing really well. An amp or 2 that you know really well, and maybe just play the guitar a bit more rather than just switching out the gear all the time. For me, gigs are an opportunity to sort of play around with setup and stuff like that, and I feel comfortable doing that because I'm really comfortable playing the set with my band. So it's kind of like gives me an opportunity to try bits of gear in different environments. But ultimately, if I was being really serious about a specific gig that I really cared about, that had to be perfect or whatever, I do know, I think, what I'd be taking. I don't know if you guys feel the same. Do you have like a number one of all these things? If you've got several of these things, do you have number one? So let me know your thoughts in the comments. And yeah, that's what Bruce Lee taught me about gear. Fear not the guitarist with 100 guitars in their collection. Fear the guitarist with 1. You know, your Jonathan Kreisbergs, I'm trying to think of now iconic. Your Gary Moore type. Obviously these players have more than 1 guitar, but you get what I mean, where they've had this guitar, Pat Metheny, that has basically been with them for the whole run. I think that's a really cool thing to see in a lot of ways. We talk about Robin Ford with the Dumble. What about Robin Ford with the Zen Drive? That's like, talk about a piece of gear that has been sort of totally melded with Robin Ford. The Zen Drive, of course.